Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be looking at the flood in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11 says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open." Now, notice how exact that is given. It's not you can't give a date because they didn't use dates like 2016 or things like that. Instead, you have it's all comes under the guise of Noah's life in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day. Very exact. That's as exact historically as you could get for that day and age. And so the water, notice, comes from the fountains of the great deep. That is, waters from under the sea burst forth, and also the floodgates of the sky are open. So a very, very vivid picture of water coming from the ocean and also water coming from the sky. Verse 12, the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, this brings up the question, was the flood local or universal? There's universal language that's used throughout. The waters lift the ark up above the earth. We read in chapter 7, verse 17. The waters prevailed and increased upon the earth. The waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. All the high hills were covered. That's the language of universality. The water rose 15 cubits. Remember, we said that a cubit was the distance from your forefinger to your elbow, so about 18 inches. That's a good section for the water to rise above the mountains. And we read in chapter 7, verse 21, that all flesh died upon the earth. Not just all mankind, but all flesh dies upon the earth. The waters prevail then for 150 days. So normally we think of the flood, the rains coming for 40 days and 40 nights, but for 150 days, and the flood's not going to end after that. That's when it's going to turn and begin to go down, and we'll look at that next time. But the prevailing of waters, in fact, the entire length of the flood is going to be just over a year in length. On the other hand, it's been noted that there are arguments that support the idea of seeing this as a local flood. So we're going to pair those up one against the other. The universal idea is seen where the biblical account says that the waters cover the whole earth. We just looked at that. On the other hand, the word that's translated earth, aretz is the Hebrew word there, it's often used to describe a localized area, so that Abraham's going to be told by God, come, leave your home and your land, that is your earth, your aretz, and come to this aretz, to another land that I'm going to show you. And it's not like he's leaving planet Earth and going to another planet, but rather he's leaving one part of the aretz and going to another one. The biblical language goes out of its way, however, to use language of totality, all life under the heavens and things like that. On the other hand, the account is given from the viewpoint of the narrator, and it's from his perspective that the destruction is described to be total, so that all life that he can see. He's not, he doesn't go into describing different continents and things like that. That hadn't been revealed yet. Supporting this universal idea is the size of the ark. It indicates this was no rowboat. This was no local flood. It was a huge endeavor for that day and age. On the other hand, the size of the ark is not necessarily related to the extent of the flood. It was big enough to carry all the animals and all the people that were there at that time in history. The purpose of the ark was punishment of worldwide sin, and it could be argued that in a local flood, some might have been able to escape. On the other hand, God could have made certain that all flesh was destroyed without flooding the entire globe, and so that really doesn't necessarily come into it. It's been argued that there are worldwide traces of a flood, and yet the evidence is questioned as to its universality. I'm not a geologist, so I find it difficult to evaluate both sides of that argument. At the same time, when we come to the New Testament, 2 Peter chapter 3 uses the flood to describe a picture of a coming future judgment that is universal. 2 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4 start off, "Know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation." And of course that's taking us back to the early days of Genesis. Peter goes on to say, "For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water." That's a reference to the description that we see in Genesis chapter 1, where there was a separation from the waters and dry land appeared. And Peter goes on to say, verse 6, "Through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water." So what we have is that original description in Genesis 1 of the earth being made, and there were waters over the earth and waters under the earth. And that all comes together in the destruction of the earth with the flood. But now notice where Peter goes with this. Verse 7, "But by his word, the present heavens and earth are being reserved not for flood, but for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men." Peter says there's coming another day of judgment, another day of destruction, not by waters of a flood, but rather by fire. Will you be able to withstand that day? Will you be saved from that day?